Hi, previous staffers. Welcome to Academic Module 2. This is Rachel, as you probably already know, and I am going to apologize ahead of time because I still have a cold and have been coughing a ton, and so that may happen while we're recording, and if I have to re-record every slide where I cough, um, well, I will never do this. This will never get done. So, you'll have to bear with me. I'll try to keep it quiet and turn away from the mic, but just so you know. Anyway, moving on from that awfulness, this is Academic Module 2. Module 2 is going to focus on 3 different components that we're going to talk about. The first component is going to be going into a little bit more about who our student populations are that we help at Preview. This is some of the PowerPoint slides that we didn't get to cover during our first time in class right before PATS. So I want to go back to that and spend some time talking about our student populations. We're going to talk about universal tracking and how that applies to our students, what that means. All of you are aware of it. You're probably familiar with how it affects you, but we're going to talk about it in a much more general sense. And then we're also going to talk about the building blocks of a schedule and how to start or how to help a student begin to think about how to create their own personalized schedule while they're at Preview. On a different note, I do want to thank everybody for their engagement in class yesterday. I wasn't there, but Nigel told me that you guys are all pretty great and that you had some good questions and it was a good class. So I want to thank everybody for being present and for just being there and doing what you need to do and meeting our expectations. So that's very exciting. And then last but not least, homework 2 should be up on Monday. This hopefully is going to get released on Friday. If it's not and it gets released on Monday, then homework 2 should be up the same day. It just depends on how fast I'm able to get through this, again, with my throat and my cough and everything. As always, write down any questions that you have as we're going throughout the module. You can ask them, email either myself or Nigel, or ask them in class the next time we're in there, anything like that. But let's get started. So our first component, who are our students, our UF student population. So let's jump in. So from a broad strokes perspective, I can't talk, and so it begins. From a broad strokes perspective, we're talking about our students in kind of this generalized idea of students that are coming in that are summer B admits, which is going to be our promise students, our fall students, which is going to be high school AA. Honors can be summer B or fall. We've got Innovation Academy students. We've got PACE students. We have a lot of different student groups that we're going to explain or talk about and break down as we go throughout this part of the module. So we're going to jump right in. Promise students. Promise students were formerly known as AIM. So if you yourself are a Promise student, you might know it as the AIM program. It's not an acronym. It wasn't an acronym with AIM. It's not an acronym with Promise. It's just the title that they've chosen to go with. They changed it over last year. This program for students is run through the Office of Academic Support. These students are selected by the admissions office based on different criteria. And so usually students that are in need of in some way, it could be because they have lower test scores, they're coming from a geographic location where there might not be as much funding and therefore not have as much access to AP, IB, ACE classes. It might have to do with the lower family income, it might be first generation status. There's different components, criteria that the admissions office is looking at. And they're looking for the potential of the student that are coming in this program, but helping those students connect and make their way to UF to be successful students here. The students that are admitted for Promise are admitted for Summer B only, so you would only see these students at the Summer B sessions over the summer. And they attend what we call the quote-unquote regular preview sessions, but they have a slightly modified schedule. So for all of our Summer B sessions, you would have Promise students that are going to be there. They're going to, however, be grouped together for the small groups, and they're going to be working with Promise advisors so that they get a little bit more focused information that is going to apply to the program that they've been admitted into. HSAA students, so High School AA, which is what HSAA stands for, High School Associate of Arts. These are our students that are earning They're Associate of Arts, so they're 60 credit hours, usually of dual enrollment coursework, but earning their AA degree while they are in high school. Now, I know many of you are high school AA students, and that might make you think like, oh, I've got this on lock, I know this information. You don't, because a lot is changing this year for our HSAA students, so it's important to make sure that you're keeping up to date with this new information and adjusting your advising accordingly. High school AA students are going to be fall admits only, so that's a big change. It used to be that we would admit students as high school AAs for summer B or fall, but it's going to be fall admits only this year. They can be either freshman admits or transfer admits. What that means is that HSAA students are evaluated in a two-step process potentially. I don't want to go into too much detail, but HSAA students are evaluated at freshman level, and if they're not admitted, they're then evaluated at transfer level. In the past, the transfer level that we used to, or the transfer criteria we would use, differed because everyone that came in the past as HSAA had 4 years, so time to explore and time to do their degree and to graduate. Even if they wanted to graduate faster, they had that extra time. That's not the case anymore. So students that are not admitted as freshmen but admitted as transfer high school AA students are now going to have to graduate within the 2-year time frame for our transfer students. So that's very different actually than what it used to be. This is important on another level because that means that the students that are admitted as high school AA transfers are going to only be allowed to go through transfer preview. So it's actually kind of nice because it does separate out and we don't have to get too confusing, or we don't have to be confusing for our students or get too confused ourselves when we're working with students at the high school AA sessions, which transitions to the next piece, which is that there are actually separate preview sessions for high school AA students that are admitted as freshmen. Excuse me. So our freshman high school AA admits are going to have the option to attend one of 2 different HSAA specific sessions over the summer. And again, only going to be freshman admits there, fall admits only, and they're going to go through a 2-day preview session, very similar, but a little bit more tailored to HSAA, but very similar to our other freshman admits. If a student is an HSAA student and admitted as a transfer, they're going to attend the 1-day transfer preview session and go through because the information they're getting is going to be the same as what a transfer student would get. So it's just important to recognize that because in the past that wouldn't have been how the 2 populations of HSAA students, the 2 admit populations, would be handled or work, how we would advise them. And again, just like I said before, students will have at least 60 credits, mostly dual enrollment coming in. We'll spend more time talking about HSAA. We're going to spend more time talking about honors and Innovation Academy. All the populations I'm going to talk about, we're going to spend more time going into them in depth later on in the semester. So don't worry if I'm only covering things briefly. Honor students. So honor students are going to be admitted for either summer B or fall. Predominant amount of the honor students come in through the fall, but we do have some summer B honor students. Students that are honors apply. It used to be a little different, but now students that are admitted to UF, they can apply. And if they are selected to join freshman honors program, and this happens prior to preview, they have to opt into it. So they have to apply. I think there's like bunch of essays they have to write, and if they're admitted, they then have to go in and accept the acceptance, essentially. So you might have some students that come to preview who say, well, I applied for honors and they selected me, but if they didn't follow through on saying yes to that acceptance, then they're probably not going to be in the honors program. So if that happens, go find someone from New Student Family Programs, one of your pro staff, and ask them for help to see and make sure that we know what's going on with that student's eligibility eligibility in honors. And these students attend, again, quote unquote, a regular preview session. They have a slightly modified schedule because they're advised by honors advisors, but they're attending all of our sessions throughout the summer. There's just going to be a small contingency or small component of honor students at each of our preview sessions. Innovation Academy. So here's where we start to differ a little bit more. IA students, or Innovation Academy students, are spring admits only. So those are students that are admitted on a spring-summer term sequence. So as opposed to a student who's admitted for fall-spring or admitted in summer B, but they're a fall-spring student, these students are admitted for a spring-summer term, and their fall is essentially the equivalent of a fall admit summer term. They attend, again, quote unquote, regular preview sessions, but only certain sessions are open to Innovation Academy. Now, this might change. So, this is how it was last year. There's a good reason to think that it's how it's going to be this year, but there could be a little bit of a shift here. So, we'll follow up with you if that changes. But for right now, as far as I know, there's only going to be like a certain 5 or 6 sessions that are Innovation Academy friendly, if you will, and where we would find Innovation Academy students at, but they would be there with other students that have been admitted for the fall semester. And their preview schedule is slightly modified to account for this and to make sure that they're getting the information that they need for their program. PACE, so Pathway to Campus Enrollment. These are for fall admits only, or rather, PACE is going to be fall admits only as well. And PACE students attend a 1-day PACE preview session. There are 4 options available throughout the summer, and the students come in and have a kind of a truncated version of what the 2-day preview session is. Meet with an advisor, excuse me, register for classes, all of that. Very important academic piece of preview, but it is all condensed into a 1-day program. These students start as, excuse me, my throat. These students start as UF Online students with the intention to transition to on campus after meeting specific criteria. And we'll discuss this in more depth later of what that means. But essentially, these students are going to be taking all online classes for at least a year, if not 2 years, before transitioning to on campus to finish up their degree. And then last but not least, we have 2 student groups that don't necessarily have like a lot of like specific admission criteria, but are worth noting because they are student populations that we see that kind of can be have an impact on what kind of advising they get, or excuse me, I'm gonna have to drink something. I apologize. Diet Coke, my lifeblood. Okay, that's gonna be a theme. So international students, so students that are coming in from other countries, we tend to see these students arriving or attending preview at the sessions that are right before the term starts. So it might be the session right before summer B starts or the session right before fall starts, just because it can be very expensive to travel internationally, as you can imagine. And therefore, we want to make sure we have these options for students that only have to travel once, where they're coming to preview and then going directly and starting their semester, or they can just stay in that time in between because it's such a small gap of time. International students might need other kind of assistance with visa information. So this is just really important and helpful to know that there's going to be students that are coming in that we might have to assist in different ways. First generation college students, this could be students that are MFOS, so the Matched in Florida Opportunity Scholars, or it could just be other students that are first generation, maybe not getting the MFOS scholarship. These students are, and we talked about this, hopefully you guys talked about it in the other room at Pat's, but we spent a decent amount of time talking about it in my room, which was really great, about what first generation college students, the pros and sometimes the challenges that students can face when they're coming in, and so being aware of that. And that's also something we're going to spend more time talking about, but it's just good to be aware that there are all these different types of groups or different types of students that are coming in, and they all have very individualized, nuanced needs, both on a macro level for their programs, but then also on a micro level for their individual, everything that's individual about them. So just exciting things to kind of think about. All right, preview staffers, let's talk about the second part of our module, which is universal tracking. If my voice sounds different, it's because I recorded the first part of this module on Friday, and I hoped that over the weekend my voice would get better, but sadly, not so much. So, still raspy, still coughing, but we will soldier through as preview sometimes needs us to do. So, without further ado, universal tracking. Now, before we jump into the specifics of critical tracking or universal tracking, we're going to use those terms interchangeably. I want to talk about the purpose or the reason behind why critical tracking even exists. So there are 3 goals that I have on the screen here. The first is that it's designed to give students timely information about the courses they need to take and the GPA required for their declared major. And this is important because we want students to make sure that they are performing successfully in what it is they're choosing to do. Some students have a hard time letting go of certain majors if they've decided it's something that they really want to they really want to stick with, and sometimes they need little nudges maybe outside of those areas to look at other majors where they might show more success, and we can use critical tracking to evaluate that. Another goal is to monitor minimum progress and determine a student's fit. So it's pretty similar to what I just said. Those two kind of go hand in hand. And then, of course, to help students graduate promptly. Obviously, if a student is sticking around in a major they're not performing well in, if they're not passing classes, that means that it's going to probably extend their time to graduate. And we want to make sure our students are graduating within a timely fashion. And that's going to usually be around 4 years is what we're always shooting for. It's a big thing right now at UF is timely graduation rates as it's evaluated by the country. Excuse me. And of course, we've actually received national recognition for this program. It's actually become something that's been implemented at many schools. Different people from the University of Florida's campus have gone and done workshops and talked about how universal tracking or critical tracking works at other schools, and then that's been adopted by those schools. So it's actually a very popular program and something that we've been utilizing here at UF since even before I started here 12 years ago, and it's been very successful. Excuse me. All right, critical tracking criteria. So this should look very familiar because it was one of the questions on your homework. And critical tracking is made up of 3 different criteria. When we evaluate critical tracking, we're looking at critical tracking courses, so specific courses in the major. We're looking at either the UF GPA or the overall GPA, and we'll talk about the difference between those two things in just a second. And then we're also looking at the critical tracking GPA, so the GPA for those specific critical tracking courses that we're evaluating to make sure that the student is performing and going to be able to continue successfully in the major that they're pursuing. So let's talk a little bit more about the critical tracking courses part of the 3 critical tracking criteria components. So required coursework that needs to be completed by a certain time. Why is that? So like we talked about when we discussed the purpose of tracking, this is to show progress in the curriculum and to show skill level in that field of study. We want to make sure that students, again, are successfully performing in the classes that are required for the degree early on and not just taking, gen eds or other classes for like a minor or something and not actively making progress in their degree. This doesn't allow that. Tracking makes sure that students are taking those classes early so that students are finding out early if they're able to perform well in that particular major. So what do we mean by required coursework? This can actually change based on the major for the tracking. So example 1 is if a student, so this example that we're going to use is for English. Example 1 is that the student can take any class from the list of all the major courses, and all of those classes are going to count in the critical tracking coursework and towards the critical tracking GPA. So critical tracking is looking for any class from the list of major courses, so that is a very broad option for students. The second example that you might find is that there might be specific classes listed. So for example, architecture. So for architecture's critical tracking for term 1, it's going to say students must take ARC 1301 specifically. So there's no flexibility there. It's not saying take a class in the department. It's saying here, take this one very specific class in this very specific semester. And then example 3 is really a combination kind of the two. It's providing specificity of what the students have to select, but it's giving the students a group to choose from. So the example that we could use here is business. Business has 8 critical tracking courses that students need to take by the end of their 4th term. And the first semester is select 1 or 2 if you're in finance, but usually just select 1 class from this list of options that we're going to talk about, and I'll show you an example of what that looks like in a little bit later in the module. But so you can see that it's not just all required coursework is going to count here or that would apply. It's actually going to be different for each individual major, so students want to make sure that they're paying attention to that when looking at the critical tracking criteria in the undergraduate catalog. So let's talk about critical tracking criteria, the UF overall GPA. So For most of the majors at UF, the very beginning, what we're going to be looking for to be on track from a UF overall GPA standpoint is just going to be a 2.0. The student just has to not be on probation their first term. So this is not something that you have to overly focus on during preview, other than to make sure students understand that their UF or overall GPA can go up each subsequent term depending on the major that they're choosing. It might stay 2.0. It might go up to a 2.5, or it might go up to a 2.75, a 2.8, or a 3.0, depending on the major it is that they're looking at. But usually it goes up incrementally throughout tracking and not just all of a sudden, all at once, here's the GPA you have to be at, bam, get it done. Now, in terms of terminology, UF GPA, when we talk about that, that is specifically classes that students are taking only at the University of Florida. So for a student who's coming in as a freshman, so a first time in college student, they aren't going to have a UF GPA yet because they haven't taken any Florida courses or UF courses yet, right? Overall GPA includes all coursework from all institutions. So if a student took classes dual enrollment, or let's say it's a transfer student and they're bringing in classes prior to starting at UF, that's going to be, that GPA is going to include not only their coursework before, but also their coursework at UF as they start earning grades here. It's important to distinguish this because sometimes students will get confused and think, well, but I have a really good GPA, so I meet this requirement, right? Because I took these classes at Broward State College before, Broward College before I got to UF. But if the tracking is looking only at UF GPA, which a lot of the majors do, they're just looking at UF GPA, then that actually isn't going to apply or have any weight in that evaluation of whether or not they meet this particular tracking component. Some majors do look at overall GPA, and it'll be clear about that in the tracking information when you look at it. And it's worth noting that as well in case a student maybe doesn't do so well before coming to UF. It's not necessarily that it wipes the slate clean, so it's important to note both of those options, but understand that for the most part, a big portion of our majors are going to be looking at UF GPA, and that's it for this particular tracking piece. Now that we've covered the UF overall GPA requirement and the critical tracking courses requirement, we're going to talk about critical tracking GPA. Critical tracking GPA is exactly what it sounds like, which is GPA that includes critical tracking courses, which is that coursework that we talked about, those options, those examples that we talked about a few slides back that are required for the major that we're using to evaluate success in that particular area of focus. Now, critical tracking GPA can actually be evaluated two different ways, not to keep throwing different examples at you, but it is important to understand this. Some critical tracking GPA will factor in all courses that count towards the major. So the example I have on here is criminology. Any criminology class that you take towards the degree that it's major specific, so not necessarily like a gen ed, but a major class. Any major class you take for criminology is going to factor into the critical tracking GPA for that degree. That is not always the case. So the other example I have on here is economics. Economics requires that you complete, there are 4 specific courses for that major, and not to get into too much specifics, but micro and macro and survey of calc and stats. It's not important that you know that off the top of your head, but just as an example, I'm just giving this to you so I can be more specific about what I'm talking about. So there are 4 courses that economics requires for tracking those 4. Now, the major, of course, requires more coursework. You have to do intermediate micro, there's economics electives that you have to take, and all of that. But the economics tracking GPA is only factoring in those 4 courses that I initially said, that micro, macro, survey of calc, and statistics. So even though there are additional courses required for the major, those aren't going to impact the tracking GPA. It's important to note this because sometimes students will ask you or just say, well, I'll have, this will help with my critical tracking GPA no matter what class I take. For the most part, I want to say that a lot of the majors do follow example 1, which is to include everything, but it is something that we want to be careful of because there are some majors that don't. And so paying attention to that when we're looking at the critical tracking information in the undergraduate catalog is going to be important. That being said, either example doesn't matter. Critical tracking GPA, no matter what, is always going to include all attempts in all courses that are critical tracking courses from all institutions. So it doesn't matter if a student took a criminology class at Santa Fe College and then took a class here. All classes are going to count towards that degree, or towards that tracking GPA rather. Now that we've gone over all three of the different components required to meet critical tracking, I want to talk some more about some of the tracking fundamentals and how tracking applies to students from an overall standpoint. Tracking is only looking at fall and spring semesters. Those are the only terms that are considered tracking terms, except for Innovation Academy. Of course, Innovation Academy, because they're they're following a spring-summer schedule, their tracking terms are actually spring-summer, and then fall is going to be their non-tracking term. Whereas for our summer B and fall admits, summer is our non-tracking term. The reason it's important to note this is that summer can be a really great opportunity for students to either get ahead in their tracking or to catch up in their tracking if they discover or decide to pursue a major that maybe they didn't know that they were going to take or be interested in when they first started at UF. And so summer can be, or again, fall for IA, can be a really great opportunity for students to either catch up or move forward ahead of the game. All incoming freshmen are considered to be in tracking term 1 regardless of incoming credits. And this applies also to our high school AA admits that are admitted as freshmen. Now again, like we talked about very early on in the PowerPoint about how high school AA students that are admitted as transfers are going to be considered under a different policy. So that doesn't apply to these students. But for our high school AA freshman admits, or B admits as we call them, that's an internal term, they will be considered in tracking term 1 regardless of incoming credits. So even if they're choosing a major they don't have any background in, that's totally okay. They're still going to be tracked for term 1. Tracking in the past has only ever existed, or not existed, but tracking in the past has only ever gone up through term 5. After term 5, students were no longer tracked. That is no longer the case. UF is actually moving this year into an 8-term tracking model, which we'll talk more about as we have more information. It's still kind of a newer thing later in the semester, but I do want to make sure everyone's aware, because this is going to be something that's very different than everything that you've experienced thus far. We are no longer tracking for just term 1 through 5. We are now actually tracking for term 1 through 8. What that means for term 6 through 8 most likely isn't something you have to worry about, but if it is something that applies to you as a preview staffer, we'll make sure to let you know. Now that we've talked about the importance of being on track and how to get on track, I want to talk about what happens if a student is off track, because obviously they're going to ask you about that. Now, students can be off track, excuse me, with 2 different ways. They can be off track if they're not taking the correct courses, or they can be off track, or I guess they could be off track in both ways, if they're not meeting the required GPAs. Now, for the most part, the required GPAs aren't going to be a factor in your discussions during preview. It's going to be focused mostly on courses, but it is good to make sure that we're not ignoring GPAs entirely, so that if, let's say, something happens in their first term or first year with their coursework and they're not performing as well as they hope, they're not taken by surprise that GPA is something they're being evaluated on when it comes to being on track. So let's say a student is off track. What happens is that a hold is placed on their record, and it prevents them from registering for classes until they talk to their advisor about the situation. So it forces that student to talk with an advisor to discuss a plan. That's the whole idea, is that if a student isn't performing well in their coursework or not taking classes in the major that they are pursuing, that it's going to force a conversation, which is really important because that goes with the idea of reflecting and making sure that you're in a major that's a good fit, that you're able to succeed in when, especially early on at UF. Now, if a student is worried about their first term tracking, you can always suggest exploratory. However, that being said, I would not push a student towards exploratory if, let's say, they're going to be off track because of placement. So if a student knows that they want to be in, let's say, for example, APK, which is Applied Physiology and Kinesiology. And I'm kind of going off the top of my head, but let's say that one of the tracking or something tracking wise is that they need to be in, let's say, a higher level math or chem the first semester. But let's say placement puts the student into maybe intro to chem or basic college algebra. That's fine. The majors, the colleges are all willing to work with students that are off track due to placement versus students that are off track because they're like, no, I can't be bothered to take the courses I need to. So definitely encourage a student, as long as they're comfortable, to declare the major they really are interested in, even if they're going to be off track due to a placement concern. And we'll go over that a little bit more when we get into placement, because that's really where this is going to become the biggest factor. But if the student gets very nervous about the idea of being off track, even if it is placement related, and they would rather declare exploratory, that's okay too. They have a lot of different options. Now let's talk about what happens if a student comes in and already has terms 1 and 2 and possibly even 3 met, and how is that going to affect tracking potentially for a student? Because the default idea would most likely be to just jump ahead and keep moving up and tracking coursework and going, okay, term 1's done, term 2 is done, and then you should do term 3. But we do want to be mindful of what the courses are and why that might not always be the best plan for the students. And we're going to use business administration, the general studies focus, as our example here. So as you can see, this is the list of the 7 courses that the student has to complete by the end of term 4 for business. And let's assume, so the classes that I just highlighted here, these are all classes that are freshman appropriate. They are okay. They don't have any prerequisites. A student could take those in their first term without any problem. So let's say the student comes in and has ECO 2023 already done. We could look ahead and say, okay, so here's this list. ECO 2013 and STATS 2023 are good next step classes the students could take in their first semester at UF to move forward, get ahead in the tracking for business administration. But let's say they have all 3 of those classes already completed. Then we run into some other conversations. So the CGS 2531 is highlighted in gray, but technically that also doesn't have a prerequisite. So that one actually would be a white one. It would be okay as well. The gray, the ISM 3013 and the MAC 2233, both of those have prerequisites or placement is needed to be able to take them. Therefore, they're not automatic next steps that the student would maybe take. So it could be something where maybe you are recommending the prerequisite for those courses in the fall to move forward, or potentially recommending those courses. It's not that they're not freshman appropriate, it's just that they have prerequisites the students would have to meet at a time. And then that leaves us with ACG 2021 and 2071. So financial and managerial accounting are not freshman appropriate. They are not recommended by business to take in the first semester. They're not recommended by anybody to take in the first semester. Students should not do that. Students should not take financial or managerial accounting in their first term at UF. Definitely not. But it can be a little bit misleading if, again, the student comes in and says, well, I already have the ecos done, I have stats and survey of calc done, I'm going to take CGS in my first term, but I also want to take another tracking course. Really all that we're left with is financial and managerial accounting, but those aren't freshman appropriate. So even though it definitely helps to look ahead to tracking and see what else is out there, keep in mind that there is going to be a stopping point for almost every major that we want to be mindful of, so that we're not just letting the students just run rampant and take whatever classes are listed in tracking. They're not all freshman appropriate, and we need to be mindful of that. So just for fun, and because I like to, spice things up in our modules, I have on here some semester 1 tracking courses that I'm going to show you, and I want you to pause the module, or, I'll give you a couple seconds, and I want you to try to see if you can guess the major that's associated with the critical tracking criteria that I'm going to show you. So our first example is MAC 1147, which is pre-calculus, or MAC 1140. So the term 1 tracking requirements for this major are MAC 1147 or MAC 1140. So take a second, see if you can figure out what major that might be. So I think most people would probably guess something maybe in the sciences, maybe business, depending, because, math, that's kind of where your head's at, but it's actually, dun dun dun, psychology general track. So this might seem counterintuitive if you're thinking, well, okay, if you're interested in psychology, why is MAC 1147 or MAC 1140 the term 1 tracking course that's needed? I honestly couldn't tell you, but psychology has deemed it to be important, and so we're going to go with it because they get to decide that. But it does also highlight the importance of, and again, we'll talk about this later too, it does highlight the importance of looking beyond tracking to make sure that the coursework that's required for term 1 tracking is going to give the student the best idea of what the major is. Definitely want the student to take the MAC 1147 or MAC 1140 if they're thinking about psychology as a major, but I also am probably going to suggest that they take a psychology class, either PSY 2012, which is the opening psychology class, or taking a freshman appropriate upper division psychology class if they already have PSY 2012 completed, so that they can continue to make progress and really explore the major in a class that's more content driven based on what the degree actually is, if that makes sense. But this is just a really good example of how you can't always tell what the major is based on what the first term tracking courses are. So let's do another. Chem 1025 or Chem 2045. So you've got Intro to Chemistry or General Chemistry 1 and Lab. What major do you think this is first term tracking for? The answer is microbiology. Microbiology either in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences or the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences. This is one of our shared majors, which we will learn, which we will learn more about when we do the college presentations. Stay tuned. But either way, either college, microbiology has Intro to Chem or Chem 1 and Lab as its course or first term tracking courses that you need to take to be on track. So second to last one, penultimate one. Complete one of the following. So you'll notice that this is one of those third options I talked about when discussing the critical tracking coursework, where you have to choose one from a list. So you have some flexibility in your choice, but they are structuring what your options are. It's not just like take one of whatever. So the list is as follows. You've got either biology, you've got Intro to Psych, you've got statistics, you've got Intro to Sociology, or you've got one of the micro or macro economics classes, or I'm trying to remember what food resource economics, I think is what it is, if I'm not mistaken. I apologize if I'm wrong about that. But one of the following. So what major do you think this is? Family, Youth, and Community Sciences. I would never have guessed, but I mean, really, I wouldn't have. That definitely is veering into other areas that are kind of away from what the major actually is. And again, that's not necessarily for us to judge or try to determine. This is what they've determined to be the tracking coursework and what they want students to focus on. But again, it goes back to kind of highlighting what we talked about with psychology, which is, okay, great, let's make sure you're on track and taking one of these classes, but is there another class that we can take that's a little bit closer to the content area of the major that you can then, use to explore if that is a good fit for you? And there may be a class that we can use in that regard, and there may not be. It just depends on the major and what we're talking about, and if, again, it's freshman appropriate or offered. The next part of our module is going to focus on how to help a student build a successful and intentional summer and fall schedule. So if we're going to talk about building a schedule, let's actually talk about the components that are going to make up that schedule. And we're actually going to break each of these areas down in more depth as we go throughout the presentation, but it kind of helps to see from a general standpoint what we're talking about right now. And also understand that some of these things are going to seem a little redundant. We're going to have things that we've already talked about a little bit in previous modules or classes. And the reason for that is, we want to make sure that we're hitting all the points repeatedly so that they are sticking with you in your mind for when you're working with students. So, bear with us as we go over things multiple times with you. So on this list, this is in no particular order, and it's important to recognize that because a lot of times students seem to think that this is the order in which they have to really apply their class selection for their first term. That's not necessarily true. I mean, you could have a student who doesn't know what major they want, so major interests becomes a little bit more difficult to identify. You could have a student who has all their general education courses met, or the only general education course they have left is in an area they don't like. So again, you want to keep in mind that this is a good roadmap, but it's not going to be applicable to every single student that you work with. So, approach everything with, an open mind. Now, courses can fulfill multiple requirements. And this is another thing that often gets overlooked. If you have a student who's interested, let's say, in psychology, which I recognize as like my fallback major, I think we talked about in class, psychology is going to meet a lot of different general education requirements. It's going to help a student meet social behavioral sciences. It's going to help a student meet biological science requirement, mathematical sciences. So there's a very strong possibility based on whatever major the student chooses, or if they have pre-health aspirations, that their courses that they're going to take are going to fulfill multiple requirements. But it's good to note that credit's only going to count once. So even if, let's say, it's applying towards the major and applying towards a gen ed requirement, the student doesn't get double credit. It's just going to help reduce the hours needed in each place. And again, no particular order. And apparently I was really excited about exclamation points when I made this PowerPoint, so I apologize. A lot of exclamatory statements. So moving on to talk about tracking, and here is a great example of that redundancy I talked about in the last slide, where we are going to go over things multiple times to make sure that we are really hammering it in and that you really understand everything that we are discussing, even if it means that we talked about it 10 minutes earlier in this module. Hooray! So let's start at the very beginning, which is also a quote from a movie, and I could sing it for you, but I won't. And if you're very well behaved, maybe one day I will sing for you. But that has to be earned. And now I gave you a really big clue, so I have faith that you are going to figure this out. It's pretty obvious if you know it. So let's start at the very beginning. Obviously, tracking term one, when we're helping a student build a schedule, tracking term one is where we are going to start. However, if tracking term one is met, as we talked about in the tracking portion of our module, we might look at going ahead to 2 or tracking term 3 or 4, or maybe even 5, but we don't want to get too crazy. Because again, like we discussed in those 2 examples where we blacked out a couple of those options, some tracking courses are not going to be freshman appropriate no matter how many of the other courses the student may have complete. So we do always want to keep that in mind when we are looking ahead to see if the student can get a little bit of a jump into some of those other tracking areas. And the other thing about the taking a tracking course the first term is, again, with some of the components, not all of them are going to be appropriate or applicable to every student. There's always the possibility that a student cannot or will not take a tracking course his or her first semester. Some majors don't have term 1 tracking courses, as we discovered a few slides ago when we were looking at the different guess the major based on the tracking term 1 classes. Some upper level tracking courses, like we talked about, can be inappropriate for first semester students. And so it's important to remember that just because we talk about tracking and how important it is, it doesn't mean that we need to set or want to set this idea in the student or this expectation in the student that I will absolutely take a tracking course my first semester, because sometimes that is unrealistic. Sometimes it is inappropriate based on the coursework, and sometimes it's unnecessary. And so we want to make sure that we're setting that right expectation for our students. And then obviously, students can get on track for multiple majors at the same time. So don't forget that. When we're talking about how to use tracking and major interest to build a schedule, if a student's interested in multiple majors, as you know now, or you may have already known, there are some majors that only require 1 tracking course for the first 1 or 2 or 3 semesters. So help those students explore majors early as possible, again, if appropriate, so that they can have enough time or have as much time as possible to figure out what major it is they might want to pursue when they earn their degree. Moving beyond tracking for a minute, but still sticking with major interests, I want to talk about what happens, or being mindful of the fact that tracking doesn't always help a student explore. So again, my go-to example is psychology. I know I use it all the time and I apologize, but it works in a lot of situations. So for psychology, for example, as we discussed when we were going over to the tracking portion of the module that the first term tracking course for psychology is Mac 1140 or Mac 1147, pre-calculus. Important, of course, because it's related to the major, and psychology is deemed to be an important focus right from the very beginning for students that are interested in psych, but not necessarily the best indication of whether or not a student is going to enjoy the major, right? So this is a good example of it may be helpful to suggest another course, whether it's a tracking course or outside of tracking, that maybe is more content focused on, or that's probably not the terminology I want to use, but that has a little bit more information about what the major actually is so that the student can make sure it's what they want to pursue. So for psychology, I would recommend that a student take PSY 2012 or Intro to Psych, or a different, upper division psychology class if they already have Intro to Psych through incoming credit. This just gives the students an opportunity to, explore the major itself, the actual content of the major, to make sure it's a good fit. And I would recommend this, of course, in addition to the tracking course, because that's obviously very important too. But I think you want to make sure that you're not just looking at one and not the other. Some majors are going to have more structure than others, and it's important to recognize this right from the very beginning, because it's going to possibly have a lot of influence on helping a student maybe declare a major or selecting classes in their first term, because as we've talked about previously, there are some programs that are what we call lockstep. And that means they don't have a lot of flexibility, which we're going to talk about flexibility a little bit later in this particular module. But in a general sense, don't have a lot of flexibility for students to kind of jump into their coursework later. The example I have on here is actually architecture, because as you can see, for semester 1, you've got Complete Arc 1301 and 1701, which are the history of architecture and a design class for architecture, which are both, somewhat time, if not a lot, very time intensive and require a lot of focus. Now, it could be something where in other situations we might go, oh, well, you have a lot of flexibility. You could just take one of those classes or, wait on them. But what you'll notice is that semester 2 has ARC 1302 and 1702. And if you're thinking, well, that seems, interesting that they're the next number up for each of those classes, perhaps those are prerequisites, you would be correct. They are. So that means that if, let's say, a student doesn't take ARC 1301 and 1701 in their first term, they're really setting themselves up for being behind in architecture, because already in semester 2, we've got 2 classes where those were the prereqs for term 1, and we're just moving. We're snapping forward. So it's important to recognize that there are going to be some majors that are going to be what we call lockstep, and that we want students to try to get as on track as possible right from the very beginning when they are selecting their classes. Other areas that kind of fall into this category, I would say, are engineering to a point, depending on how many incoming credits the student's bringing in. I would argue that majors in the College of the Arts tend to be pretty specific in terms of what courses they can take. Some science majors, but again, there's some more flexibility there than not. But for the most part, I would say those are probably the ones that are pharmacy, definitely, especially if the student's trying to do a 2 or 3 year plan. But otherwise, for the most part, it's pretty open. Some, again, are more flexible than others. Some majors are more flexible than others, but still not nearly as stringent as some of the ones we've suggested. We mentioned a little bit earlier the value and the ability to actually help a student get on track for multiple majors all in the same term. And so this is actually going to be an example that will help will show how you can do this. We use this slide actually in our exploratory PowerPoint in the college presentation session at Preview. So you're actually seeing what students will see unless we tweak it during the exploratory presentation on day 1. So in this example, we've got 3 different majors, and when I say different, I mean like very different. You've got general business, you've got philosophy, and you've got mechanical engineering. Pretty much the spectrum of areas that we can get at UF. And you'll notice that I've noted already on here how many tracking courses are needed for semester 1. We've got 1 tracking course for business. There are no tracking course requirements for philosophy. And the mechanical engineering requires 1 tracking course, but 2 are recommended. So let's actually take a look at what this means. So my recommendation, or rather kind of just this general idea of what tracking courses we'd want to focus on, are the following. For general business, Survey of Calculus counts as a tracking course. But if we want to jump over to engineering, Calc 1, Mac 2311, counts as a tracking course over there. Now, we haven't gotten into this yet during placement review, so don't get too overwhelmed with what replaces what and what supersedes what. But just very quickly, Mac 2311, which is a 4-credit calculus, algebra, and trig class, is going to supersede or be a higher level than Mac 2233, which is Survey of Calculus, which is algebra calculus specifically. So we can actually use Calc 1, Mac 2311, both for engineering and for business. So we've already got that kind of locked in, which is nice. Now, if we're looking at other tracking courses, mechanical engineering talks about recommending 2. So Chem 1 and Lab would probably come into play here. And then even though there are no required tracking courses for philosophy, I'm throwing in Intro to Philosophy just because, hey, it probably is a good idea for the student to explore the major a little bit. We've talked about in the last slide, or the slide before rather, that the value of making sure the student is exploring the content of the major in addition to making sure they're on track. This is a perfect example of that in this option. So then if we're actually looking and building a full schedule for the student, you'll notice that we've got Calc 1 on here, which covers our business and engineering tracking. We've got Chem 1 and Lab on here, which goes beyond engineering tracking into the 2 recommended classes as opposed to the 1 required. We've got Eco 2023 on here, which is an extra class that helps with business tracking. And then we've got PHI 2010, which is going to help with philosophy tracking, but again, for term 1 is also extra. So we've got 15 credit hours, which is a manageable course load, 12 to 15 hours for a first semester student. And we've got 4 classes, or really 5 if we include the lab on here, that help us get up to term 1 tracking, if anything, get ahead, possibly even with term 2 tracking for all 3 of these very different majors. And I could do this all day, and we will actually do some examples of this in homeworks and in the academic lab so that you can actually practice and see how easy it is to help a student get on track for multiple majors in a lot of different areas. So college requirements. So we're going to learn more about this during the college presentations, the specific college requirements that are associated with each individual college at UF. But I do want to kind of cover some of those general points, kind of like the components of a schedule, those general areas that students are going to bring up or focus on that are college requirement related. And so those are going to be foreign language. Some colleges have a foreign language proficiency requirement. You might see some students talk about how they have to take an advanced writing or communication course. That's going to be college related. Some colleges have quantitative option coursework that's required. Some colleges are going to have additional general education requirements beyond what's required for the state core and then also the university requirements. And some colleges are going to have a specific number of upper division electives, or students are going to have to complete a concentration in an outside area of study. Now, is this something that you have to be completely aware of for the student? No. But we do like you to be, reasonably knowledgeable about the fact that these college requirements exist so that, if a student's bringing it up, you're not like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But you have to memorize all of these specific requirements for each college? No, of course not. That's a lot. The biggest one that we're going to see is going to be the foreign language. And we're going to talk about that more as we go along. Don't worry. We got you covered. But it is something, that we'll see the students most likely bring up because they'll see that they have a foreign language requirement, and we get that line that we hate to hear, which is, I just want to get it out of the way my first term. This is one of those big ones where we're like, oh my gosh, no, not that. Because if they're already feeling apprehensive about a first term, about taking a language, then, taking a 5-credit language class your transition semester to UF, probably not the best plan. So that's one of those ones where we're very much about like, don't do this right away, wait But like I said, we'll get into that more as we go along. Okay, electives. So this is actually one of my favorite parts because I'm a big proponent of elective coursework. I think electives are great. I think they're fun. I think they're often misunderstood and overlooked, and I'm going to tell you why and get you hopefully very excited about the opportunities and places that students can take these classes. Oh, the places you'll go, Dr. Seuss style, with electives. It's a lot of fun. So what do I mean by electives? Electives can be anything. Electives are pretty much the basis of all coursework until it becomes something specific. So what I mean by that is if, let's say, a student is taking a course towards their major, but they change their major, and now all of a sudden that course is no longer required, it becomes an elective because that's its default position. The same thing with gen eds. If a student is taking a gen ed humanities or gen ed social behavioral science, but that's a general education category they've already completed, then it becomes an elective. Everything at its basic level is an elective course. And so it's good to kind of remember that because students get really worried about things not counting towards, if they change their major, if they move things around, all of a sudden things don't have as much value or meaning. Not true, because everything falls under an elective category. So how many electives can a student take? That depends entirely on the flexibility of a student's schedule, and we're going to actually talk about that in a second. We're going to look at some examples that will hopefully help kind of give perspective to how much flexibility each student has. And it also depends on how many incoming credits they're bringing in, right? So if we know about the flexibility of their schedule, let's say we know they can take, this many elective hours, well, okay, but let's say now they have a bunch of general education coursework already met with their incoming credits. Okay, so that might up their flexibility, more electives are allowed. But now we have to take into consideration when they want to graduate. Let's say they're high school AA students, and they're like, okay, I have 2 years already done, I want to take another 2 years at UF and then graduate. Well, now we have to scale back that flexibility because we have a limited time frame that they're using. So again, it depends on the student. It depends on a lot of different variables. Also, we need to take into consideration summer classes. Anytime we're looking at a semester by semester plan to determine flexibility, usually that plan does not take into consideration summer coursework. So if a student wants to use summer classes, like we were talking about with tracking to get ahead or to catch up, or to get some general education courses completed, then that might free up more flexibility during the fall or spring terms to be able to take more classes, more electives in other areas. And so you can see the problem. It's confusing and it's subjective and individual for each student. And so again, it's not something that you have to figure out for every student. My gosh, that would be insane. But it is helpful to know from a general standpoint how electives work, how to help students determine their own flexibility within their programs so that they can kind of go home and do that on their own and then, take ownership in terms of figuring out what classes they want to take their first semester and be able to take electives with confidence and not worry about how that's going to apply to them later on down the line because they know they have that flexibility to begin with. That's what we're trying to get at here. So let's take a look at electives and the flexibility that can kind of be created based on the college or based on the major. So all of these majors are going to be 120 hours. I think I only have it on the first slide, so just keep that in mind. And we're looking at political science, so this should be pretty self-explanatory here if we're looking at it. You can see that about a fourth of the requirements are the major requirements. We've got college requirements, and we've got general education and electives. Now, general education, you're going to actually see shift a little bit by major because what I did is that just like we talked about with psychology way back before, some majors are going to absorb the general education coursework within them. So for example, political science, a lot of the courses you're taking for poli-sci are going to be social behavioral sciences. So I took those away from the gen eds and absorbed them into major requirements. And you're also required to take statistics for political science. So again, 3 hours of now the coursework required for mathematical sciences is absorbed into the major as well, which is why that's changing. Now you'll notice for the elective part that we've got 44 hours on there. Okay, so 44 hours, that's a pretty big chunk, right? It's about a third of the pie, if you will, is electives. So this student has a lot of flexibility, and this doesn't take into consideration summer coursework. It doesn't take into consideration incoming credits, which a lot of our students have. So you can see how it would be very easy for all of a sudden this third to become a half in terms of the flexibility and open-ended opportunities available for the student, whether it's doing another major or doing minors or just taking general hours in areas of interest. But it's helpful for a student to realize this in the beginning so that they're not so focused on all the specifics, when all that's going to do is then just create so much flexibility later on down the road. If they have other areas of interest right now, why not pursue them? This is a great chance to do that. So let's look at a different major. So let's look at health science. So you can see major requirements doubled, right? So we jumped a huge part there. So it's actually a little bit over half. But by doing that, you can see the college requirements actually are very minimal for health science, and general education also went down a little bit as well because it was absorbed within the major requirements. So electives actually is now exactly a fourth, so not quite a third, but still 25%. So there is still some flexibility for this particular major within the College of Public Health and Health Professions. And then let's take a look at finance. So another popular major in the College of Business Administration. So again, major requirements going up a little bit, but college requirements in general education staying about the same. So the electives went down a little, but still there, still available for students to explore. Now, are the electives going to get even smaller in some of the other colleges? They will. The College of Engineering is actually going to have very little flexibility. Art, some of the College of the Arts majors are going to have little flexibility. School of Architecture, so the architecture major is going to have very little flexibility. So there are going to be some that are going to be much smaller in terms of the elective part of the pie, but that doesn't mean that, one, the students aren't going to have some flexibility, because again, a lot depends on general education coursework already being completed through incoming credits, and a lot depends on summer courses. If a student is willing to take summer classes to help kind of open up some flexibility during the term. So you want to keep all of those things in mind when working with students. So using electives effectively. So how do we help students do that? And so begins your journey into helping students make intentional choices. So you are going to hear me use this a lot. You probably have already heard me use the phrase intentional choices at least several times. You're going to hear me use it a lot more times before all of this is through. And for that, I will not apologize, because I am a huge fan of making intentional choices, not only in your coursework, but also in your life. And this is very appropriate for students, because now, as students at UF, all of a sudden they have all of these options and all of these choices to make. So it's not even just about coursework, but all of a sudden they have all of these choices in terms of the clubs they're going to join, organizations, volunteering, generally, like, should I go to class today? Things like that seem, in some ways maybe not the biggest choice that they're going to have to make, but it's still a lot of choices. And again, that intentional part is really, really important, because I really believe that, if students are really thinking about what they're doing and why, they're going to have a much better experience at UF, and also just a better, hopefully life experience, because the more intentional you are, I imagine the happier you'll be. So the applications for electives, and this is just some of the many ways in which they can apply. So obviously, if a student's interested in exploring or changing majors, prerequisites for pre-professional programs, hooray alliteration, yes, I'm an English major, deal with it. If they're thinking about double majors or dual degrees, obviously electives can be used for that, or exploring minors and certificates. Taking additional gen ed classes that you enjoy. So again, that elective piece. And then also developing skills. Developing skills gets a bit of a bad rap, or at least gets very commonly ignored, because people really like the stuff that's, I like to call it bright and shiny. So the double majors, their minors, their certificates, the things that you actually have a title. Students really like that. They like the title. And I get that. I understand, it's nice to be able to say, here's what I have. It's harder to kind of identify and share, I have these skills. But in the end of it all, the skills are really going to be what employers are looking for, and are really going to help sell, students, which includes you guys, to different employers or graduate programs, pre-professional programs, all across the board. So it's important to recognize that skills are going to be very important in helping students, and it's okay for you to talk to students about that for their first term. So when I talk about skills, this is what I mean. So if you actually want to take a second to kind of make this a little bit more interactive, and think about the different skills that you think students could probably build upon at UF, take a moment and think about and write down maybe some skills that you think are valuable, and then pause it, because obviously I'm not going to wait, because that would be weird. So I'm assuming you paused, hopefully, maybe not, it's up to you. But here are some of the skills that you could possibly think about recommending to students, and this is by no means a comprehensive list. One of the ones that we hear the most often that employers are looking for is communication. And what we mean by that isn't necessarily only public speaking. That seems to be the default place to go with, but really interpersonal communications, the ability to work on a team, listening skills, active listening, which a lot of you mentioned as important values for a great advisor, and I agree. And so you're actually going to be working on a lot of these skills as preview staffers. And so again, it's important to recognize the skills that you're building, either inside the classroom or outside the classroom, because those are going to be things that you're going to utilize and share with employers later in the future. So other skills that are valuable: quantitative skills, ethical decision making, leadership, second language skills, multicultural awareness and appreciation. I can't stress this one enough. A lot of great ways to really help students become more aware and informed globally. Or even just multiculturalism in America is obviously study abroad as a great way to do that. There's different alternative breaks that go to different countries, but also different places within the U.S. to explore different areas of multiculturalism and diversity. But the biggest thing is that, students come in and a lot of times will have their international general education course already met. Sometimes diversity, but that's a little bit more rare. But either way, encourage students to challenge themselves and take additional classes in those areas. There is so much value to knowing more about the different cultures and ethnicities that are out there, and it's only going to help make them more competitive in the job market, to be more aware of, and not just in terms of diversity from ethnicity standpoint or a cultural standpoint, but also diversity from the standpoint of sexual orientation, or from people with disabilities, or gender, or socioeconomic status, or political beliefs, or religion. My gosh, the list goes on. So challenge students, maybe not the first semester, but definitely make them aware that it's up to them to kind of push those boundaries and to learn more. Even if it's just taking a class or two, as we saw, they have all this flexibility available to them. Use one of those two options, those flexible courses, to really explore other areas that are unknown to them, so that they are learning more to bring to the table later on. Writing skills. Can you write an email? Now that seems maybe silly, but you would be surprised how many emails I get from students that lead me to believe that they are incapable of writing, one, an email that is proper grammar, English, sentence structure, any of the above. Two, also polite and respectful. End of rant. But you'd be surprised. So writing skills are usually something that students need to still, build upon, even if they already have their words met. Computer skills, what systems do you know? How is your typing? Professionalism, a grasp of social media, flexibility and adaptability, multitasking. These are sometimes a little bit harder skills to pinpoint from a classroom perspective, but still things worth exploring with students in terms of helping them, build those different transferable skill sets that are going to be helpful to them in the future. So, credits and hours. What we're talking about here, and this is important because I'm going to make a distinction here that I don't think we've talked about yet, but if we did, again, I apologize for the redundancy, but redundancy is helpful. But I think it's really helpful to distinguish between the credits and the hours and the number of classes that students are going to take. So students will most likely take 2 academic courses summer B and 4 to 6 academic courses in fall. Or you can also say it, students may take approximately 4 to 7 hours summer B or 12 to 15 hours in fall. Now, the reason that I like to specify both of those things is because Students, if you say to a student, let's say, okay, I really want you to take 12 to 15 hours in fall. If they, let's say, took 12 one-credit classes, which I recognize is unlikely, but let's say they did, that is a very different course load than, let's say, taking 4 3-credit classes, which is also going to be 12. Yes, math, did it. Awesome. So we've got 4 classes, 4 finals, 4 midterms, and we've got 12 classes, 12 finals, hypothetically 12 midterms. That's going to be different. I don't care what anybody says, that's going to be a lot. So even though it's the same number of hours, the number of courses matter, right? So there's going to be a difference. The biggest place you're going to see this is going to be actually in Summer B, because while it might be okay for a student to take like 2 to 3 academic courses Summer B, let's say they take 2 3-credit classes in first year Florida. Great, that sounds fine to me. But if they, let's say they wanted to take a 3-credit class and then 4 1-credit classes, that's going to be the same number of hours. That's still 7 credits, but that's a lot to take on in Summer B, in my opinion. So I know it depends on the coursework that they're selecting, but still, you want to be very careful with that, because it could really overwhelm the student, just because the number of, finals or papers or whatever it might be that are going to be due, it just could be a lot. So it's important to distinguish between those 2 options and make sure you're sharing both with the student, because there is a difference. And I know this is cheesy and you're going to hear it a lot, but transitioning to UF is like taking a 3-credit class. And it really is. There's a lot going on, as most of you probably very clearly remember since you were recently freshmen. There is so much going on that first semester. There is so much to figure out and to learn and to get used to. And, why have a student take on more than they can handle their first term just because when that transition is kind of like taking what we say a 3-credit class. Now, sometimes that's going to help students really put into perspective the amount of coursework they're putting together for their first term, and it will help them kind of dial back their crazy a little in terms of what it is that they're going to take. Now, that's not going to work for every student. So one of the other methods that I found to be very helpful is, as opposed to saying to them, which sometimes this will work too, as opposed to saying to them, okay, well, if you take 15 credits, there's a stronger possibility that you're going to fail or that you're going to struggle a great deal and you might not be as successful in your coursework. I'd much rather have you get 12 credits of A's than 15 credits of C's. Sometimes that doesn't quite work, because most students, as you know, who came into UF came in with very high GPA and who don't really know what getting a C or anything lower than maybe even a B feels like. And with that, it is hard for them to really grasp the idea that maybe they will not be super successful. So that argument might not feel applies to them. In that situation, if you feel like that's what's happening when you're trying to make that argument with a student, what I would recommend is coming at it from a different perspective. And what I will tell students is I will say to them, look, I understand you actually might be able to do this. Maybe taking 15 or 18 credit hours or 4 science courses or whatever your first semester, you know what? Maybe you can handle it. Maybe you're the student who really can get it done and you're going to be successful in those courses. But what I can tell you is that I'm going to guess that at the end of it, you're going to be miserable. You can probably handle it. You might be great at being able to get it done, but are you going to be sane at the end of it all? Are you going to have enough time to really appreciate all of the other components that UF has to offer? Are you going to be happy during the term? Are you going to be so stressed out trying to get everything done that you're going to be miserable? That tends to resonate with the other percentage of students that don't listen to the first 2 arguments. So I would recommend going that route, because you're, again, not implying that they're going to fail. You're implying that they're just going to be overwhelmed and miserable. And most of those students can then grasp onto that logic and go, you know what, you're right. I could probably do well, but maybe I would be overwhelmed and it would be too much. So I'm going to, dial it back and not take so many hours my first term. That actually is a good argument, and one that I encourage you to use in a positive way when trying to help students look at that balance piece of first semester scheduling. But the other thing that's really important to remember is that each student is an individual. And so what fits most students, so that general recommendation that we're making, there are going to be the outliers. There are going to be those students that are going to take 18 hours and they're going to be fine and they're not going to be stressed and they're amazing and that's wonderful. So we do want to be cautious. Obviously we want to make sure we're giving our best recommendations, but at the end of it all, every student is able to make the choice for their own. So what you do is you make the best argument possible. You present all the facts, all the information. You make sure that they're hearing you. You make sure that they are understanding what you're saying and why, and not just shutting you down entirely. And if at the end of all that, they're making the choice to do what they want to do, then that's their call. Because, some of them actually are going to be fine. And that's great. They know what they can handle and they're willing to do that, and that's okay. But it is one of those things where, it's good to remember that you can't fix everything. You can't, make every student do what you want them to do based on what, to be most likely the best case scenario for them, because every student needs to kind of find their own path and figure that out for themselves. So providing perspective. So here are just some general tips, and I know we're getting a little bit long, so I will wrap this up, I promise. But these are just general tips that I found are really important when helping students work with academics. So who you are at UF is more than just a major. And this is a big one because students are asked so many times when they get to preview, before preview, what's your major? What are you majoring in? What are you doing with your life? We put so much emphasis on this, and there's reason to, in the sense that yes, your major is important, and it is going to have an impact on the classes that you take, right from the very beginning. But, we don't really give students the opportunity to say, I don't know, with any sort of level of comfort. It is very overwhelming for them if they are unsure, because so many people are asking them what it is that they're doing with their life, as if somehow their major is going to equal that, which of course we know is untrue. A major does not equal career. So it's really important to make sure that you are creating an environment that lets them know that they are more than just their major, that it is okay if they are unsure, and it's okay even if they feel like they know, that it's not the only thing about what they're doing here that's important. As UF is made up of so much more than that. We looked at that schedule that showed how much flexibility students have. It's not just about your major. It's about a lot of other things as well. And it's about the experiences that you have as you grow as a student. So you want to make sure that you're emphasizing that, and you're really showing that as a student leader, because it's going to be something that's going to be very important for them to see when they get here, because up until this point, it might not be what they've really heard or experienced. We are preparing students to become global gators. So again, going back to that importance of that multiculturalism, that global awareness, when students leave here, when they transition, and you included, you're representing the university and for forevermore. And that means that we want to make sure students are, aware and appreciative of all different types of people, all different walks of life. And so it's important to remember that we're preparing students from a much broader perspective than just that, okay, first term classes, one and done kind of thing. Again, the key is to make intentional choices. If a student is really thinking about what they're taking and why, there is very rare that we're going to find any student who's going to be unhappy with their first semester schedule. They're really thinking about the classes they like, and they're really trying to figure out the best possible path for themselves. Then they're going to be happier their first term, I guarantee it. So again, if they have to take a gen ed, or if they're really focused on taking a gen ed, help them make sure that they're taking one that they're interested in. Intentional choices is going to be everything. And as you guys know, this is a question on the homework, always challenge and ask why. It's really important, and again, do it in a respectful way, not in a threatening, why are you doing this way? But ask them, why. One, somebody might not have asked them yet, and just the fact that you care enough to ask might really be very helpful. But two, again, it's important to make sure that they've thought about it. Why are they wanting to take this particular class? Make sure that if they're making intentional choices, they're making intentional choices for the right reason, and not because, they heard it's an easy class, or, their friend is taking it, therefore they have to take it, which segues ever so nicely into this. There are no easy classes at UF. Easy implies you don't have to do work. And I know this was something that we talked about at the retreat, and I know that some of you struggle with this concept because I know some of you don't believe me, but try, okay? I know, again, you're representatives of UF. I don't want you to lie, but I also don't ever want to hear coming out of your vernacular, oh, this class is an easy class. That's not true. What's easier for you does not mean it's easier for the student. And again, easy implies you don't have to do work. I challenge you to find one class at UF where you don't have to do anything. And I've seen students fail every type of class at UF. So trust me when I tell you that there is no easy course. There's simply courses that are less challenging for you, and it's really important to remember that. And also, there are no classes at UF that are a waste of your time, and this is something that also applies to what is the good life again. Every class has value and purpose if you put in the effort to find it, and that applies to you guys, and it also applies to how you work with your students. Everything is about your attitude, right? It's about how you choose to look at everything. It's about, how you choose to pursue certain things. And if a student is putting in the effort, again, kind of with intentional choices, if a student is putting in the effort to find why the class is going to teach you something, even if it's a class that they end up taking that they don't like, that teaches them something that they don't like. If they're paying enough attention, it might teach them even more than that. Not just like, I don't like this subject material, but I don't like this type of class, this type of structure. I don't like classes that are back to back. I don't like a teacher that teaches in this style, or whatever it might be. There's so much more to learn, even from situations that feel like they are already, that maybe are generally negative. So every class has value and purpose. Every general education requirement, everything, if the student is willing to put in the effort to try and find it. Again, choose your attitude. So let's wrap up this module with a couple more providing perspective points. Yes, alliteration. Awesome. Do not recommend 2 science labs for a student's first semester. If you've ever taken a lab at UF or really anywhere, you know that the 1 credit lab is deceiving because it's 1 credit hour, but 3 hours of work in class, along with approximately 6 hours of work outside of class. Now, imagine if you're a student doubling that in the first term. That's a lot. It's a lot for anybody to take, and it's definitely not something that we want to recommend students do their first semester if we can help it. Another really important point to make sure that you're talking about with students is trying to help them understand that it's probably not the best idea to take all of their courses in one area of study, whether that's one area of study of their major or all in a certain general education category. They might love the idea of taking political science courses or history courses or anything really, and just really be passionate about that material and that content. But if you're taking all of the same classes in the same area, it's easy to burn out because you just get tired of the information. It's easy to feel overwhelmed because you're using the same parts of your brain every single day. And when you're studying, we want them to have a wide range of content that they're comfortable with their first semester. So it's important to make sure that they're diversifying their schedule to include, of course, the things that they're interested in, but within reason of different topics, different categories, so that we're hitting all of those points. And then last but not least, do not force a student into a course no matter how good your intentions are. And I'm talking specifically about SLS 1102 or First Year Florida. It's easy to get carried away when you're trying to help a student find those courses. And if you know that First Year Florida is a great class, and I know it too, I love it, I teach it, I get that. But sometimes students aren't really feeling it as a good option for them. And I've had students in my class that didn't really want to be there, and I can tell you it's not fun because it really changes the dynamic of the class. So we don't want students in that class if they don't want to take it. Also, you don't want to be that staffer that really pushes the student into a course and then find out after the fact that the student was really unhappy and maybe didn't do as well in it. That student can easily come back and say, hey, this is your fault. You really pushed me into this. And they'd be fair in saying that. And you don't, trust me, you don't want that responsibility. That's a lot of pressure to put on yourself. And it's no fun if a student is saying, hey, this is, I'm in this because of you and I'm not happy about it. So definitely encourage students to think about it, to consider it. Encourage them if they're not sure about it right now to take time to mull it over and contact you if they have any questions. I definitely want students to really be aware of first year Florida, or really any class, but just never go too far down the line of pushing them into something, even if you think you know what's best for them. And no matter how good your intentions are, again, the students still have to make their own choices. So tying into that, remember, with great power comes great responsibility. A wonderful Spider-Man quote. So don't screw it up. And I say that with love. Nigel and I both know that you guys are going to be amazing. You're going to be great. We have all the faith in you. Otherwise, we wouldn't do all of this crazy stuff with the modules and the labs and class. We wouldn't take all the time to do this if we didn't have the utmost faith in your abilities. But as we've talked about, make sure you're putting in that time, that work, that effort, that you're asking questions. But we are going to be here for you every step of the way. And remember that it's a process, and that we want to make sure that you succeed, but give yourself time to learn everything and rewatch the modules and take lots of notes and all of that good stuff. So I hope you enjoyed Module 2, and I look forward to seeing hopefully most of you at the academic lab on Monday. Have a great day.